Hi there, it's Mark and welcome to episode 7 of Adobe Photoshop for Photographers, our series of video tutorials aimed at improving your Photoshop skills with a photography bias. And in this episode, we're going to be doing a quick recap on the homework I set in the previous episode. What, you haven't done it? You've left it on the bus? Or did the dog eat it? No excuses, I'll show you what I did with the homework. Then we look at some photo filters. LUTS as it's sometimes called, or colour match as it's also called. We'll be looking at a recap on some selections because we're going to be doing some selections throughout this tutorial, and also start to look through the filter gallery. There's a lot in the filter gallery, so I don't expect us to get too far into it before we then have to pause and go and look at it in the next episode. This is one of the pictures we're going to be working on today, and as usual, this picture together with the others we use are all on my website in a zip file, and I'll post the link down below in the comments or to the side in the comments depending on what sort of device you're at. If you don't see those, you should see something around the notes which says show more. Clicking on that expands all the notes and you'll see the links together with chapter markers, so you can jump back and forward throughout this tutorial at your will to recap on some things, to jump over things you're already very familiar with, and so on. So as a teaser, if you're interested in taking a picture and perhaps warming it, or indeed cooling it, or perhaps orange and teal is your thing, or applying a little tilt shift blur. So here you can see the blurrings at the top and the bottom, but the band in the middle is fine, so that kind of draws your eye in. Or iris blur, where the clear bit is in the middle and it slowly gets blurred in all directions on the way outside. Or let us have a quick look at one to the more less used but interesting effects, such as this, which starts to introduce an oil painting type effect. That's your bag. Stick around, the titles are coming in about 10 seconds. No, the titles are coming now and they'll only be 10 seconds. Cue the titles. So in the previous episode, we looked at how to change any colour to any colour using two separate techniques. In fact, we looked at my Ferrari here, wanting to change the colour because I was getting bored with it, to something possibly about greenish. I fancied that colour. And I left you some homework to see how you would get on changing something without playing along at the same time. And it was this picture. Picture of my wife walking away from me in the forests up at Cragside Hall, I do believe. So the original top she had on was an orangey peachy type check, and what made it different from the Ferrari was that there's lots of different luminosity values here and it is not all predominantly one colour. So my solution was to do both a colour fill on a colour blend mode and a hue and saturation fill on a normal blend mode. So this file is in a separate link, also listed down below if you want to go get that and play along. And if you haven't covered that episode yet and you want to do that, then press pause, shut me up now, go back to the previous episode and play along. And then when you've done that, come and rejoin us again. Okay, let's move on, shall we, to today's topic, which is starting with photo filters. This is what I showed you at the beginning, so let's just get rid of all of these and start from scratch with this picture. In fact, let's just delete them all. So the first thing we're going to do with this picture is just take a copy of it, Control or Command J, and we're going to run a filter on this called Camera Raw, or ACR, Adobe Camera Raw, or you might even know it as Lightroom. This is kind of Lightroom as a filter within Photoshop, and we've touched on this before in previous episodes. So here we go. Camera Raw filter. It does everything Lightroom does, except it just looks a bit different. So all I really want to do here is just give the brightness up just a little bit. So I'm going to just click on auto, and then I'm going to straighten the horizon, which you find under the tag called geometry. And if you just click that one there, which is automatic level correction, and I'm just going to click OK. Not really too fussed about this being pristine and precise. I'll learn to speak in a minute. So let us apply a photo filter, and they live down here in the adjustment layer toolbox, and they are called photo filters. Now this is a bit of a throwback to earlier days of photography where you would put filters to put different effects in front of your lens. And indeed, you can actually still buy coloured filters to do this, except you don't have the same range on a physical filter as you do in post, where you can actually change it at a whim. And that's what we're going to do. So as I apply that, the default is 25% density on a warming filter. If I switch that off and on, you can see the effect. Let's increase the density. So we've got more of this warming filter come through. And again, off and on. You can change the opacity as you can with every adjustment layer, or rather with every layer. And you can also mask this. So if we decided that we didn't want any of this yellow to be coming through on these posts, we could click on the mask, B for a brush tool, D for default colors, X to get black, because that will hide the effect. I'm just going to soften the brush. And if I just brush down on here, I'm painted black on this mask here. Not quite, actually, that looks grey, and that's because my flow wasn't at 100%. So I'll try that again. I'm deliberately going to go outside the edges here, so you can see that it is actually taking away. You can see the grey coming through. You can see it's taken away. X to change that back to a white brush, and I'll just correct those. So you can see how you can use a layer mask also to limit or target areas you want the filter to apply. Other than that, it's a very simple tool to use, and you can select through to see which ones you prefer, and you can change the density, as we've said, but also luminosity. What does that do? Well, if we switch it off, you're getting this cooling filter applied to all of the picture. It applies across the whites, the highlights, the midtones, the shadows, and the darks. It doesn't really do much with pure white and pure black because you can't. But it is a common cast. Here we are saying, yeah, I appreciate that, but can you be respectful of the fact that there's luminosity values in here I want to preserve. I want to leave the darker bits really dark, and I want to leave the lighter bits very light. And so it can become a bit more subtle of an effect. And of course you can choose your own colour. Now this is where I tend to use this. If I had a colour cast on this picture, because this is real time, if I just move this around, take it up towards the reds, and then stop playing in here, you see real time the impact on the image. So you can use this to actually try and remove a colour cast that you're not happy with. How do you know where to start? Well, generally it's opposites. So if you had a blue cast, you'd start to put a filter on which is the opposite of blue, which is yellow. And vice versa. If it was yellow, you could put a blue. If it was cyan, you'd look to red, and if it was red, you'd look to add a filter of cyan, and if it was green, you'd look to add a filter of magenta, and if it was magenta, you'd look to add a filter of green. I'm getting tongue-tied here. But this is where it's good, because it's real time. I don't even bother. I'll get the ballpark of the colour, but I don't even bother looking when I'm down here. I stare at my picture, and I move it around to try and get rid of any colour cast that is there. And in a simple form, that's it. That is how you use a photo filter. So do have a play. There are a number of filters in here. One disadvantage is, unlike other things, you can't actually save it if you choose a colour. You can't actually save as a preset. So let's have a look at one or two other filters now. In the introduction, we'll look at a couple of blur ones. Now I am going to have a particular episode which will have a lot in blur, so I just want to touch on one or two here just to whet your appetite. And we're going to start with a whoops. I say whoops, I clicked on filter and they're all grayed out. And I initially thought, what had I done wrong? It's quite simple. I'm currently on a layer that doesn't allow you to blur because it's an adjustment layer. So let's go back to our actual layer, which has something in it. And now if I click on filter, there they all are. And we're going to look at a blur called tilt shift. And I'm going to show you how it works on this, but I'm going to give you a far more appropriate picture to use it on. Here we have a series of lines and a strength control in the middle. but it's easier to use these sliders. So if I increase the amount of blur before I explain exactly what it does, it's taking a little while to update there. I've got a backup running. I don't know if you can hear the fan on my Mac running, but I've got a backup running. I'm not going to interrupt my backup because my data is more important than anything else. Well, anything else on my iMac, certainly. It's a close second to my malt whiskey collection. Come on. You see, it's natural to get impatient with Photoshop. Okay, so I've really cranked the blur up so we can see what's happening here. Within the bounds of this line, and the strength you can use this wheel for, but I just used the slider, you can see that it is all nice and clear. Once we go above here, it is significantly blurred, and once we go below this line, it is significantly blurred, and between the solid line and the dotted line, it falls off. It gets progressively more blurred. And there's a distortion as well, which you can bring in too. And it's dilute the taste, really. That's the effect. Now let's just make it a little bit more subtle. Let's click and drag this down. Doesn't want to play ball. Should I pause and wait for my backups to finish? No. And reduce the blur. Now it's a little bit more subtle. You're seeing that this is the primary focus plane, and your eye is drawn because the softness pulls your eye in, and that's what this filter does. I'm just going to click OK for the moment, because I'm going to show you a type of picture where this is far more significant, and that is this one. This was taken looking down from Gray's Monument, I believe, or it could be one of the car parks in Newcastle. I think it was Gray's Monument at a crowded street, and it already looks a little bit Toy Townish. But if we apply this particular filter, I'm going to take a copy first, Control or Command J, and go and choose Filter, Blur Gallery, Tilt Shift, and drag that somewhere into the middle, and click OK. This now looks like a model village or a toy town. Notice how the buses and down here are all blurred. We're quite clear in the middle, and we're blurred here. If I switch this off and on, you can see the effect. It starts to make it look like a model village, and can be a really good effect, and it really plays out well for elevated shots with people in, especially when you've got things running in the distance. You've got quite a long leading line going out, as we're doing here. That's why I included this picture. I know we're only going to use it in this tutorial for what's been a minute now, but I thought it was worth calling out. It's a really good filter to use. I thought I should point out, seeing as how the gremlins seem to want to trip me up a little bit today with greying out those filters and my backups kicking in and adding a little bit delay, that's how we do this with these tutorials. I'm not into doing a polished, precise, pristine, perfectly rehearsed, scripted tutorial. I tell you what the subject is going to be, I give you the material, we work through it together, and if we trip up on the way, we fix it. If something gives us a curveball like the backups kicking in, so be it. We carry on, because that's real world. Not everything is really polished. So I like to think that these are more real world problems we actually come across while we're doing it. And the other thing is, the ethos of this particular series is not to learn every single thing about Photoshop. It's to introduce you to topics that are more geared towards a photographer as opposed to someone who wants to put, I'm talking about myself here I guess, the time bridge inside a light bulb floating on some water with a reflection. That's actually one of my pictures, but it's more about what you would want to do as a photographer, so filtering and colour matching and such. I do have other videos for other things which I will call out as and when we come to them. Anyway, I digress. That was really for the benefit of someone watching this as the first of my videos and thinking, hang on, these aren't wonderfully fluid. Steven Spielberg's not been near these. Actually, Steven Spielberg doesn't know much about Photoshop. I've been trying to teach him off and on for years. Let's do another one, shall we? In this particular picture, we're going to be bringing back some of the little features we've done, some of the patching we've done on previous episodes, and we're also going to be adding a few filters, and we're going to be using blend modes and such. So kind of this is an example of current topics, but also not forgetting the ones we've done previously, and bring a few little things together in this one picture. But first we're going to start as usual with a copy. Control or Command J just to preserve our background layer. And let us apply another set of filters. This time they're called lookup tables, or back in the little toolbox down here, Colour Lookup. Now these are lookup tables, or LUTS. There's a lot of lookup tables here, and the easy way to look at them is to just click on one. Crisp warm look is one I prefer, even though you look at that picture now and think, but generally with LUTS I pop them into colour blend mode, and if we switch it off and on, you can see a more subtle impact of that. And of course you've got the opacity and or fill to reduce the amount of the effect on the picture. What's the difference? Well, for this, nothing whatsoever. Opacity and fill behave the same way. In some areas of Photoshop, fill behaves different to opacity, but largely opacity and fill will do the same thing. I do have a video on that which I will link to above. So crisp warm, rather like that one, but there's lots and many others, including the teal and orange effect, which again works much better in colour blend mode than it would in normal to my eye. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so it's up to you to play. But it's as simple as doing that. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all these. I'll just leave those for you to have a play with. Hello, look, horror blue. Yeah, that is a horror blue, isn't it? Okay, where were we? Let's go back to my crisp warm. What I want to do with this picture is firstly make the yacht pop a little bit. So I want it on its own layer. So I'll just delete this layer for the moment. So I want to select that. Now there's lots of ways to select things, and we could go through every single version of selection, but you know what? The easiest way these days in Photoshop is to just press W for the selection tool, and you'll see these buttons appear at the top, and go select subject. And it usually does a very reasonable job. Here it hasn't quite. The very tip of the sail is not being selected, and some of the boat, and it's over selected in here where you can see water selected as well. But that's easy enough to fix. Alternatively, we could have come to our selection tool up here, lasso tool, Control D to get rid of the current selection, and we could actually draw around. In fact, that's what I'm going to do in a moment when we come to patch this out, which we saw in a previous episode. Control D. Let's just go back to W, select subject, because I want to show you a couple of ways to refine things. We want to refine this selection, so let's click on select and mask, and Control plus or Command plus just to zoom in a little bit and just reposition this on screen. So I want to include the top of the sail, and I want to exclude these. So we could try in the first instance the refine brush. So what the refine brush is it goes over the edges again and refine an edge. So let's just dab that on the top and see how well it does. Incidentally, when I use selections, I have this red, and you can adjust the amount of red shown to mask it out visually and lower it down so you can see more of what's in the background. But there are other flavors of this view which you may or may not prefer. I prefer the overlay, so I leave it on that, but if you prefer one of the others, it's worth testing. So now let's, with our refine brush, let's just brush in here, and you can see how the selection has gone into there and done a reasonable job. And I'm just going to dab in here as well, try and encourage the selection into there. For what we're going to do, by the way, an accurate selection is not that important, but I thought I would just show you this anyway. Now, quite often in tutorials on selections, there's usually some hair to be selected, a dark colour hair perhaps, against a model standing in front of a white background, which makes it very easy. In reality, things aren't always that easy, and sometimes you have to work a little bit at it, but that's no great shakes. I would, for example, now wouldn't sweat anything. I just click on this, which is the brush tool, and the brush tool will actually select more. So I'll just go and say, I want you to select this. I also want you to select the hull of the boat a little bit more. Make my tool a little bit bigger with the right hand bracket key, and just come in here and just fix those bits there. And on the sail there. And if I make my brush tool a little bit smaller, get that mast in, get that flag in there. So I'm quite happy now with that selection for what we are going to do. I will click OK. And then Control or Command J to make a copy based on that selection. So if you copy a layer and you have a selection ready, as you can see, that selection is put onto a layer of its own. Now that looks rough and ready, but not to worry. Back here. Switch that off for the moment. Now then, I want to tidy this picture up. We're going to add a bit of blur. So let's get rid of some of the things. So I want to use our patch tool, which we saw in a previous episode. And I'm going to get a hold of this boat and its wake. Oops, make sure I'm clicking on the layer as well. And I'm just going to grab and move it to one side and patch that out of the way. For what I want to do, that's fine. And this boat here too. We'll get rid of that one as well. Control D. Okay, so we've got rid of those. Control 0 to zoom back out. Now, can we do the same with the boat? Is it too big? Well, let's have a go, shall we? So I'm just going to draw around our boat, including that buoy. I'm actually going to come in here and out, and let's see how much we can get away with here. I'm going to slide this boat now to the side, just so it disappears, and leave go. Click, move, leave go. Control D. Now that's not too bad, because we are going to be putting, I wouldn't worry about this border here, because we are going to be putting our boat back in place. Now that I've got this, I want to put a blur here to give some calmness and some motion as well to the water. So I'm going to use a filter, blur, path blur, or blur, motion blur. Both are very, very similar. I think I'll go motion blur. But first, as we've done in a previous episode and explained, we're going to change this to a smart object. The reason is I can go back in and tune the blur time and time again. If I didn't have a smart object, the blur would be committed. I'd have to do Control Z to undo it all and then reapply it. If I've got a smart object, I can keep going back in. I'll show you that now. So I've got a blur, I've got a motion blur, and do something ridiculous like that. I can just double click, go back in and undo the values that I'd previously set. And I do want this a little bit more blurry. I'm going over the top, but I'm just showing you various techniques. Okay. Now, if we bring our boat back in, that looks like a pan shot. It's over the top, but it looks like a bit of a pan shot where we're actually following the boat with our camera lens and everything else is sweeping past. But that's not really what I was after. I only really want the blur to be on the water. So we've got a filter here. So I'm just going to actually use a marquee tool. And if yours isn't the square marquee tool, you just click on and hold and choose the, square, rectangle. And let's just bring that down to there. Click on our mask, D for default colors, X to get black to our foreground because black is going to hide. Click on our gradient tool to find the other tool in that group called the paint bucket and click once. And it fills that with black, therefore hides the blur and just leaves us with the water. Control D. Now we've still lost a bit of the boat, so perhaps I was a little bit over eager earlier. So all I'm going to do to bring that back in is if I switch that off, you will see the full boat. The layer beneath we didn't actually touch. So I'm actually going to put a mask on this one. Why not fix this one? All will become apparent. Put a mask on this one, B for a brush tool, D for default colours, X to get black as a foreground colour, and I'm just going to slowly paint that there to mask out that blurred layer altogether and bring that bit of boat back in. Now the reason I wanted to separate the boat is because I now want to put a curves adjustment, so back to our little toolbox here, put a curve in, and I want to just ever so slightly brighten the boat, but that has brightened the entire picture. So if I click this downward arrow from a box, you can see it applies here. It means that this curve only applies to the layer beneath. So if I switch this now off and on, you can see the boat is ever so slightly brightened. Now I'm going to do the same here and add a curves layer. I don't need to clip it this time because I want it to apply to everything beneath, and I will just click around about there and just lower and darken the picture. So that has the effect of darkening the background slightly, and that had the effect of highlighting the foreground. So now we've made it pop. We've put a smart filter on so we can go back in and adjust things. We've used the patch tool to move things out of the way. We can now bring it all together with a lookup table, with a LUT, because I find that when you do lots of different things, and when you're doing composites in particular, and we'll come to this in a future episode, it's always best to finish off with one common effect, whether it's a curve or otherwise, to blend it all together. So let's do that now. Let's put a color lookup in. And let's see what a late sunset does. I don't believe I've used late sunset. Wow, that's interesting. Lovely clouds, a bit too saturated. So let's go and pop that into colour. And also bring the opacity down. So I'm just putting parts of that orange into the cloud and part of the magenta into the water. So there you go. Whether you like that or not, as I've said repeatedly, is irrelevant. What is important though is we've learned the various tools. So we've learned about selecting subject, methods of refining it. Importantly, we've learned not to sweat things, especially if you know what the end result is going to be. Now, if we were doing a product and that needed pristine edge of a bottle, we would have a pen tool. I'll do some other selections and different tools in future episodes, but not in this case. We isolated a subject, we lightened it, we darkened the background, we used the patch tool to move things. You could have used lasso tools, but instead we just used W, select subject. When it came to masking out the blur, well, because we had a nice horizon line, we just chose our rectangular marquee tool, highlighted the whole thing, and then used a paint bucket to paint in black. And that's more or less it. So what we've covered today, we've had to start to have a look at the filter gallery. We've looked at a few blurs, we've looked at a few selections, and generally played with color lookups and photo filters. If you found that useful, I'd appreciate you clicking on that subscribe button and click the bell icon so that you're so that you're notified of future episodes, and also give it a thumbs up and a like. Please leave any comments too. All of these help promote the channel, so YouTube thinks I'm a good, kind-hearted person and stick these videos in front of other people who are doing random searches for Photoshop or Blur or whatever. So you're giving me a little bit back, and I really do appreciate that. And we'll continue on next week, hopefully, with the next installment of Adobe Photoshop for photographers. Bye now.